So I'm sure you all know by now that it's one thing to have a podcast and another thing to market it well. As of September 2021, there were 4 million podcasts registered worldwide, and that was 3 years ago. That is a lot of podcasty content for listeners to get a grip of. So you need to stand out. Well, good news. We've put together 12 effective marketing strategies that you can use on your podcast. This list was originally written by Louise over on our blog. If you want to check out more lists like this, then head over to the description for the link.
Are you looking for a podcast or radio show to appear on? Are you struggling to find a guest for your podcast or radio show? Let me introduce you to MatchMaker.fm. Simply create a profile, narrow your niche, and use the inbuilt messenger to contact potential partners. And the best part, it's free to sign up. So, let's find your match.
Market your podcast with written content. So written content is kind of seen these days as old news. With the likes of video content on TikTok or Instagram sort of dominating our lives, written content kind of looks like it's being phased out a bit. But transcribing your podcast episodes can actually be a great marketing strategy. At first glance, it might seem like a lot of effort, sure, but people like written content. People like to know what they're getting into before dedicating to listening to it. But that's not all. Written content is still reigning supreme on Google when it comes to SEO. So if you have a website and you want to be ranked higher on Google, then you need to build your SEO, and a great way of doing that is creating written versions of your podcast, or at least providing a little description per podcast. Another benefit is kind of more straightforward, and that is not everyone can hear podcasts. By transcribing your podcast, you're making it more accessible to the deaf or hard of hearing community. This is a great way of making your podcast feel seen, included, and considered. But one thing I want to stress is don't just transcribe the podcast. Don't just write every word you say or everything that's discussed. Try and do it in a way that stands out to your audience. Like I say, video content reigns supreme because it catches people's attention better than words and lots of text. Vox have created immersive visual transcripts for their podcasts, and these look brilliant. If you could try and replicate something like this, or maybe even integrate it into video somehow, then this is definitely going to make people click. Well, not definitely. I'm not like a magician. Cross-promote your show on other podcasts. If you're not sure what cross-promotion means within the podcasting world, it basically means teaming up with another podcast to try and outreach a bit. But why would I work with another podcast? I'm trying to advertise my own podcast, not someone else's. Well, it kind of benefits both of you. Every podcast has a different audience. So if you can reach out to another podcast audience and try and pull them over to your own, great. There's two main ways of going about this. The first is ad swaps. And what I mean by this is creating a little ad, maybe like 30 to 60 seconds long, and including it in someone else's podcast for maybe like a run of 5 episodes. Within these ads, you can give the audience a little taster of what they might be hearing. And if the two podcasts are similar in each way, like maybe yours is a film podcast and the other one's a film podcast, they might listen to that and think, oh, another film podcast. I need another one of those in my life because I just love films so much. Well, great. Now they know what your podcast is all about. They know where to find you, and maybe you've got yourself a new listener. Plus, ad swaps provide a guarantee that you found a podcast fan. They're listening wherever your podcast already is, so they don't even need to like jump from one platform to another. Say they're listening on Spotify and your podcast is already on Spotify. It's a few clicks to find yours. Like I say, do be tactical about your niche and genre when you do this. If you are a film podcast, that's great, but you don't want to advertise on a sports podcast. They're probably not going to care. A second great cross-promotion idea is content collaboration. So ad swapping is a lot easier than content collaboration, but there is the possibility for greater reward. This is essentially where you invite another podcast host onto your podcast and you go onto their podcast. This obviously gives each audience a better idea of who you are and whether or not they actually want to find out more about your podcast, but it also creates the risk that they listen to you and they go, oh, this guy sounds like an idiot. This obviously gives the other podcast audience a better idea of who you are, your humor, whether or not your sort of style and vibe fits what they're looking for, and maybe they'll head on over to your podcast and have a listen. Again, if you're a film podcast and you're going over to a sports podcast, it's gonna seem a bit strange, like what do you have in common? Maybe sports films, maybe that could work, but it's a very small niche of people who love sports films enough to head on over to your very general film podcast. Create QR codes for people to scan. So back in the days of like paper advertising, obviously you'd put a poster up and it would say where to find your business. There would be a literal address. Then the internet came along and we started using URLs as a place of finding you online. Nowadays, people are very, very lazy and they don't want to type in a whole URL because QR codes exist. So if you're out and about trying to advertise your podcast in the real world, or you're at an event or something, make sure you utilize QR codes. And the great thing about QR codes is they're incredibly cheap. In fact, you can generate them for free. It's just the printing costs you'll need to think about. And some QR codes even allow you to track how many people have scanned it, so you can see if it's useful for your podcast or not. And a lot of marketing strategies you'll hear today are kind of like things you'll have to try, and if they don't work out, that's fine, because at least you tried. But at least you would have gathered data to know, I'm not going to do that again in the future. Create and optimize your website and start a mailing list. So I've already spoke a bit about SEO and having a website, and I can't stress enough how beneficial having a website can be. Social media is great, but the problem with social media is you're having to compete with lots of other things that people follow, whereas your own website is completely dedicated to your podcast. Sure, it's a bit more difficult to get people on there than social media that they're already using, but once they're there, it's all about you, baby. And one of the easiest way of getting people there is obviously building your SEO. And I'm not gonna lie, SEO can be a bit complicated, so if you don't know much about that, I would recommend going and researching it. But basically what you need to know is the better your SEO, the better you're gonna find yourself ranked on Google. And the higher you're ranked on Google, the more people who are going to find your website. Now, once you've got this all set up, you might want to start a mailing list. And this is essentially a little email, a little newsletter you might send out each week, month, year, however often you want to do it, with updates about your podcast. So say you have a weekly podcast, you might want to put one out every week saying there's a new podcast out, and that will go straight to people's inboxes. Number 5, take your podcast on live tours. So the beauty of podcasts is that you're in people's ears. So this might be when they're on their commute, it might be while they're working, it might just be when they're relaxing. And because this is quite an intimate interaction, people get to know you very well. And if your podcast does well, it won't be long before you have a bit of a fan base. And you'll be surprised just how popular live events are with fan bases. People want to come and watch a podcast live. Now, this isn't to say you actually need to record like an official podcast there and then while you're live. You don't. If anything, doing private live podcasts that no one else will listen to apart from the people in the room who have paid to see it is great. Like I say, podcasts feel personal, it's in your ears. So to do a personal event that only 200 or so people might hear, brilliant. And if you're still an up-and-coming podcast, then just booking out a little room, maybe. There's also a lot of podcast events now where you can go and take your podcast along to it and maybe try and build up a bit of a reputation while you're there. Effective podcast marketing on social media. Now, I've already spoken about social media when it comes to having a website, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't just have a website. You should also have a social media presence. Like I say, people are already on social media. The thing you need to work out is which specific platforms your audience is on. So if you have like a businessy sort of podcast, the likelihood is your audience is on LinkedIn. But if you have a more artsy sort of podcast, they're probably on Instagram. Basically, figure out where your audience is going to be hanging out and then utilize that space. But what kind of content should you post? Well, we found that posting clips from an actual podcast is probably the best thing for you. So this could be 30 to 60 seconds of a podcast that basically aims to make people go, ooh, that sounds all right. I want to listen to more. So maybe you could leave the video on a little bit of a cliffhanger, making people go, ooh, how's this argument going to turn out? Or what are they going to agree on? It could be totally up to you. But as long as you use the social media to make people go to the podcast rather than just let people be satisfied with what they're seeing on that page, that's great. So now you have your social media accounts, you probably want to expand your following on there. By expanding your following, you might expand your listeners. Now, one of the best ways we have found to do this is to run giveaways. And I don't just mean put a post out saying like this post if you want to win a hat, because people will do that easily, very easily, and you won't benefit much from it. So figure out, how can I get something from this? And the best way of doing that is making people share the post and follow your account every time you do a giveaway. This ups your following and it makes people see the giveaway who probably wouldn't anyway because the person before shared it. Plus, it's so easy to do this now with lots of online giveaway tools, scanning your post for who has done all those free things, and then only putting them into the draw. Say someone has liked the post but hasn't reshared it or hasn't followed, they won't be included. Create a podcast trailer. So it's likely you might have already done this because a lot of platforms require you to create a trailer. But if you haven't already, then a 30 to a minute and a half trailer is ideal for getting new listeners. Like I said, there's so many podcasts out there right now, and most of them are up to an hour in length per episode. So most listeners just simply don't have the time to be listening to the first episode of a podcast to know if they want to carry on with it. They need a small snippet to get an idea of the tone, if it's funny, if it's on a genre that they care about. So having a short snippet of like maybe clips from other podcasts merged into one trailer, that's perfect for what they're looking for. Some of our favorite trailers have a voiceover of the host, maybe podcast is about, and then intertwining that with clips from the actual podcast itself so it doesn't feel a bit too staged. You want people to come away from the trailer with a perfect idea of what your podcast is. So if it's just you doing a voiceover saying what they can expect, it doesn't really give the right flavor. Create a podcast media kit. So say your podcast is doing really well, the numbers are going up and up and up, and you want to start maybe sharing the podcast with the media. So this doesn't have to be like the big shots like The Guardian newspaper. It could be small, independent, local brands that maybe you think, they might be interested to know that our podcast is doing well and we're from this area. Whether it's big or small, one of the best things you can have for this instance is a media kit. And all this has to be is a shared folder on something like a Google Drive full of information about your podcast. So it could be the logo, it could be clips from the podcast, it could be reviews from the podcast. Whatever it may be, you need to give the media a quick, insightful look into your podcast without having to send emails with all this attached every single time. The worst thing you can do is tell some media publication about your podcast and then let them go and find the information on their own. They're going to be sharing old logos that may be a bit fuzzy. They're going to share clips that you don't really like that much. So by giving a narrowed view on your podcast that you have selected yourself, you're always going to get the things you like the most out there.